Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this mini-series over the summer 2026, we're looking at the future of US military in terms of C2. Not necessarily JADC2 or CJADC2 or Joint Command, but rather a look in depth at each of the US military services, their aspirations and their plans. This is important and timely. Big changes are coming for each of the US armed services, and they differ from each other and the way which they have historically organised their C2. In this episode, we're talking about the US National Guard with Lieutenant General retired Jon Jensen, the 22nd Director of the US Army National Guard. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic Incorporated, we provide innovative commercial C2 software solutions. Our SID-aware suite of products accelerates decision-making in contested environments and enables data sharing with partners and allies. Our open platform uses public APIs to connect sensors, shooters, autonomous systems, and mission applications without the need to replace existing hardware.
Now listen, the US National Guard is not like any other US military institution we're talking to in this series. Listeners probably won't need reminding that the role of the Guard makes it answerable to different command chains depending on the operation it's engaged in. So while other military services are busy, focused, preparing for major war, the Guard must balance those requirements with other demands, the frequent and dispersed activation for duties at home and abroad, wherever it may be required. That makes building a C2 system for the future rather a more difficult proposition than one might expect. If your prime driver is not just the enemy you're facing, but a natural emergency, a pandemic, civil unrest, or a disaster of some kind, the priorities for C2 interoperability are markedly different from those that are simply required to fight a peer state adversary. But at the same time, the Guard is the interoperable operational reserve of the US Army and has been deployed as such in a significant number of incidents over the past couple of decades. The nature of command itself might be somewhat different in the Guard to others too. On missions in the homeland, the Guard has operated as dispersed units for many years, right? NCOs are called on to do their jobs without the level of oversight, control or connectivity exercised by, for example, some US Army formations. They'll liaise with civil agencies and the population at a lower level with more visibility to the populace than their counterparts in the regular force. But before we get into some of that detail around this, I want to introduce my guest. There are few people better qualified to talk about the future of National Guard C2 than my guest today, Lieutenant General Jon Jensen, who has recently retired after 41 years of service, culminating in 4 years as the 22nd Director of the Army National Guard, a job that guided the formation, development and implementation of all programs and policies affecting nearly 335,000 soldiers in 50 states, 3 territories and the District of Columbia. Now go back a bit, and Jon joined the Iowa State Guard in 1982 as a combat medic and went on to become an NCO before becoming an officer. This was, of course, in the Cold War and the last period of great power competition. But since then, Jon, like the Guard, has experienced counter-terror missions, counterinsurgency during the global war on terror, as well as domestic demands of pandemics, civil unrest and natural disasters. Before his role as director, Jon served as the 31st Adjutant General of Minnesota and earlier as Commanding General of the Minnesota National Guard's 34th Infantry Division. He was also dual-hatted as the Deputy Commander of the Army Reserve Component Integration Advisor, US Army Africa and Southern European Task Force, US Army Command. He's commanded, clearly, at the company, battalion, brigade and divisional level. And he's got operational assignments, including Desert Spring in Kuwait, Joint Forge in Bosnia-Herzegovina in S414, and Iraqi Freedom, twice. General Jensen, you put all this together, he's got the experience, credibility, courage and integrity to offer us a well-rounded and complete view of the Guard and the C2 that needs to be in place for the challenges it's going to face in the future. The views of General Jensen that he expresses today are his own. They don't represent those of the US National Guard, the Department of Defense, Department of War, or any other institution. General, Jon, listen, welcome to the show. Congratulations on your retirement. Thank you for your service, sir. You're probably one of the few leaders who's been so intimately involved in the Guard for the last 41 years and seen it from so many angles, right? As our audience are a mixed bunch of soldiers, sailors, aviators, academics, politicians, as well as sailors like me, I want to start by putting everyone on the same page. And I guess this is really quite an important question. Is the Guard's approach to command and control different from the other arms of the US military, or is it sort of broadly similar?
Peter, great to be with you. Big fan of your podcast. I've listened for a while and I've learned a lot. Here's the thing about the National Guard that we have to recognize up front, both the Army National Guard and the Air National Guard, is that we're not our own service. The Army National Guard, which is I spent most of my career in, we're part of the United States Army. So as it relates to command and control, the doctrine of command and control, the ethos of command and control, the principles of command and control, we are part of that Army system. Our professional military education comes from the United States Army. So we're going to be a part of that system. Simultaneously, our Air Force or our Air National Guard is part of the Air Force service. So they are going to be under that umbrella. So where we have a little bit of friction maybe will be where those two elements come together at the state headquarters, and more specifically in our service to our states. Now, again, I think it's very important that our listeners understand this, that the National Guard is first and foremost a reserve component of their two services. So for the rest of the podcast, I'll primarily talk about the Army National Guard because that's where my experience has been. So our primary mission is as a combat reserve of the United States Army. First and foremost, we have to be able to meet that mission. Now, I was raised, as you mentioned, during the Cold War as a young soldier, a young NCO, and then later as a young officer. And the leadership theory that I grew up under and was indoctrinated by my leadership was this. You train for your most complex mission, which in our case is going to war. And if you are prepared to do that, you can do any mission less complicated than that. So we spend the vast majority of our time and the vast majority of our resources goes to our go to war mission, knowing that if we can do that, then inside of our states, we can respond to civil unrest, earthquake, wildfires, floods, tornadoes, whatever that state mission may be.
But there is surely some difficulty, and we say training for war is the most complex. Just before we came on in, we were talking about both of our experiences in Bosnia, right? And it was incredibly complex, not just the number of allies, the number of agencies you were talking to, the number of NGOs, the international organizations, aid agencies, local government, local police forces, different parts of the population. I mean, that for me was more complex in C2 terms than Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom. That was for me infinitely more complex to navigate and work within than almost the simple thing of doing command in war. So it felt to me like actually the upper end of C2 complexity was outside war, right? Which is the area where the Guard excels, right? In doing things that, well, some of the Army is doing combat. What the Guard excels at, its expertise, is doing part of this outreach, liaison, discussion. Almost it's like military diplomacy, right?
Yes, I agree with that. There is something, while it's not simple, maybe less complex, with just you're focused on closing with and destroying the enemy. But it's these other things that I think we learned in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and really they're universal lessons over the time of warfare, is that there are all these other elements that are in part of that battlefield that you have to account for and that you have to engage, and that it's not really, again, as complex as it is, it's not as simple as just closing with and destroying the enemy. And I think this is where, again, raised by the Army, regardless of what environment you're in, it still comes down to this concept of mission command, which while we think is a relatively new idea, I will tell you that in 1989, when I went to officer candidate school and then following the infantry officer basic course, we didn't call it mission command, but we talked about this idea and this concept of purpose over task. You accomplish the purpose, the task may change, but you achieve and you accomplish the purpose. And you have to understand the purpose of the mission, not just from your unit leader one level above you, but two levels. If you will, we called it the expanded purpose. What's the expanded purpose? And so when you get in these areas of where maybe you don't have as much experience or you haven't rehearsed or practiced, it still goes back to that idea. Has the commander in their intent given me an expanded purpose and an end state? And then through that, I understand my purpose. Through that, I don't want to see the task isn't important, but what's really important is that purpose. Now we call that mission command now and all the elements with mission command. But I will tell you, I think in the United States Army, that concept is a lot older than what we give it credit for.
And I wonder, your experience, combat medic, NCO, junior officer, in those years, I wonder whether you thought the National Guard almost behaved differently from big army, because the level of independence, people had a day job, right? And whether they were a student or they were, a warehouse manager, no matter what they were, they did other stuff in life. They brought different things to the party. Mission command must have suited those people a lot more than the strict hierarchy of a peacetime barracks room, drill square army, right?
Right. And plus, we're geographically dispersed as well. I was in an infantry battalion that was in the southwest corner of the state of Iowa that encompassed multiple counties. And from the headquarters to our farthest unit was over 100 miles. And you operated that way all the time. And so it really, truly was these decentralized, I don't want to call them operations, but you existed inside of your company. And the battalion commander was not a daily, hourly presence. The battalion command sergeant major, if he was going to come visit you, you kind of knew because he just didn't walk across the street. And so I think with that comes what we thought of at that time was maybe independence is what we maybe called it. Now we call it discipline initiative, or Jim Mingus calls it informed initiative. But yeah, you really had to understand what your commander wanted accomplished, because the other element of reserve component service is time. You just don't have the time. And so this is, again, where it's very, very important to understand commander's intent and purpose, because you're just not going to get as many iterations at things as you do for a soldier who serves every single day.
Most people who listen to this podcast will be from one of the Western, all volunteer force, professional militaries, day in, day out. That's their job, being a soldier. They've done it for years. They're going to do it for years. They've got the hierarchy. They've been inculcated with the knowledge. They might have done some professional military education behind them. That's a very different thing from what the National Guard is, where you have people who have jobs and families and other important things in their lives, and the Guard is just another thing. I'm not saying it's not the most important thing, but it's one more thing in their life, right? When you were commanding at battalion and brigade and divisional level, did you find this made it easier to talk to people? Did you find that they were less constrained by hierarchy? Did you hear more dissent? Was there less just straight following orders? Was there more about purpose and less about task? What did it feel like?
In my experience is that you had to be very clear in your communication. The way that I framed it was I would tell my subordinate commanders is that as the commander, the one thing I do for our organization, let's take battalion command, is my primary purpose is to establish priorities and then ruthlessly enforce the priorities, because people want to wander off and do other things. And so when time is your constraint, you have to make sure that everybody, so let's just take, hey, our training objective this year, let's say, is enter and clear a trench. And so that's what we're going to focus on. Well, you got to be careful, because a company commander might say, well, I want to work on river crossing because that's more fun. And they're like, no. And so you got to ruthlessly enforce the priorities of the organization. And I was lucky. I always served in combat arms, and all of our headquarters were echeloned in a way that when I was a company commander, I knew who my battalion commander was and up the line. When you start moving out of the maneuver world and you start moving into our logistics, just the way that we're organized, you might be a transportation company somewhere that doesn't really have a transportation battalion over the top of it. And then that gets a little bit more difficult, because you might be commanded by a commander from a signal battalion, but just the way that your state's organized, you don't have that transportation battalion headquarters. So it gets even more important is, can you prioritize? And then can you ruthlessly enforce your prioritization?
And does that work when you're on homeland missions that aren't the operational reserve as well? Because then you're working for a very different set of commanders, right? The hierarchies are different, how you're answering is different. The core of the purpose, not task, might work. But how does the mechanism work internally? You're answering to almost a politician and not a senior general.
Well, ultimately, if you get high enough in any military organization, you're working for a politician and not a military member, right? Whether that's the president, the secretary of defense, or secretary of war, the minister of defense, whomever. In our case, the governor. But here's what's really important as it relates to that. And I was very lucky in the sense that because of my assignments, I was able to, as I worked for previous adjutant generals, I was able to help create the framework for how later on I was then commanding the Minnesota National Guard. And one of the key elements is this, right? Is that below the adjutant general in Minnesota, we all fall under a military chain of command. So you might be in support of a county emergency manager, but you don't work for him when you're that on-ground commander. Let's say you're a company commander helping out an emergency or working in support of an emergency management coordinator in a county that had flooding. You're not going to take your orders from that person. We're still going to utilize the military chain of command. And the reason why you do that is you want to remove the confusion. It's very, very important you understand who you're working for at any given time. And the way that I viewed it is that at that level, we want them to continue to work through their military chain of command on this and not be taking orders from a civilian official because, one, they don't know your capability. They don't understand your limitations. They certainly don't understand your resource allocation, if you will. And so to make it as simple for the on-ground soldier, whether that was a squad leader, platoon leader, company commander, whomever, that was our intent. And that's how we went through. As something as simple and short as flood response to as complex and somewhat chaotic as civil unrest.
And the deployments in those circumstances tend to be, they're sort of company-sized groups or platoon-sized groups. It's a much smaller way of deploying people. And I know the US Army now talks about it in terms of dispersal, but these are very, very small packets of soldiers and aviators in very dispersed locations, right? They're all over the place. And connecting them all together with a single purpose to a single commander sounds like quite a challenge.
It can be. I would say, obviously the smaller it is, the easier the communication is. It gets more complex the more. So like, for example, just recently here in Minnesota during the summer of 2026, we're responding to wildland fires up at the northern end, what we call the Arrowhead area of Minnesota, which is the northeast corner of Minnesota. Those are very small aviation detachments with a little bit of logistics that goes forward. But that connectivity between that element and then back here where the command element is at is very, very necessary because, one, you're working for the governor and the governor's going to want to know what are you doing. You're in support of whether that's the Department of Natural Resources or some other agency, and they have their idea about what we should do. But then the other thing that you always have to be aware of, at least in my time frame as a senior leader inside the National Guard, is, hey, what are the other things this unit might have to do in support of the Army later on? Here is my specific example. As we began to bring soldiers on in response to the violence after George Floyd's murder, I had an infantry battalion, or 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry, that I couldn't use. And the reason why I couldn't use it at the state level was they were in the very last elements of their train up before they got mobilized and went overseas. So when the governor said, hey, we're going to use every resource inside the National Guard, I had to lay out to him really quickly, hey, sir, our aviation brigade's currently deployed. We can't use our aviation brigade. This infantry battalion we can't use because they're in the last stages of their train up and then they are going to deploy. And so you have to always balance that. You have to understand, hey, what are the upcoming missions as it relates to this? The interesting one that I struggled with initially was our 1st Brigade. So we have an Armor Brigade combat team here in Minnesota. They were going to do the first rotation at the National Training Center, July of 2020, which was the first COVID rotation that the United States Army was going to attempt to do. And so initially tried to protect them, but then the mission set just got so large that we had to ultimately bring in our 1st Brigade. And they very quickly transitioned from we're loading out so we can put everything on rails and send to Fort Irwin, California, to now we're cutting locks on our connexes, reissuing our kit, to conducting missions inside of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Now we're taking our kit back to clean and account for and load again to send to the National Training Center. So in 30 days, then we can conduct a decisive action rotation at NTC under the constraint and limitations of COVID. It was a spectacular operation that 1st Brigade did. And it's a story that's not as well known as it should be in terms of the number of 180-degree turns that brigade did during the late spring of 2020 through the end of summer of 2020.
These are really important stories as well, because they speak to the flexibility, not just the Guard, but military people generally. But the Guard, where they are putting down everything, leaving jobs as well as families and all the uncertainty that goes with it. Absolutely phenomenal effort. Listen, General, we've spoken about the past. You and I hark back to Bosnia and the Cold War. We've spoken about the recent history as well. The future of the Guard going ahead, everyone is talking about massive change programs, transformations of their C2, connecting everyone via a mobile phone and service providers and platforms and amazing systems that will reduce headquarters staff and all the good stuff that goes with it. And these are big capital programs in the US Army, US Navy, US Air Force, US Marine Corps. They match exactly their requirements for the big coming fight, right? Not just for tomorrow, the fight tonight, but also the fight tomorrow. They're throwing lots of money and effort into it. How does the Guard fit into all that? I mean, first, without even going into the frictions that you described right at the start between working for the US Air Force and working for the US Army, but just as a force, do you just come under the US Army? How is that working?
Yeah, primarily you're going to fall under the United States Army's transformation plan or transformation in contact. So I served under 2 Army Chiefs of Staff, General Jim McConville and General Randy George, under 2 Vice Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Martin and General Jim Mingus. And from the very beginning, General McConville was adamant that the reserve component was going to transform as the active duty Army did. Now, previously, let's go back to the Cold War just very quickly one more time. What you saw the model there was we modernized our active force and then we would modernize our reserve force later. But over the course of time after the end of the Cold War, our active component Army started getting so small, but our demands across the globe were actually increasing. So the reserve component is much more of an operational force now than it was previously. And so it's very important for the Army that the reserve component modernize or transforms what General McConville called transformation in contact right along with. So as the Army began this transformation in contact under General George, the 34th Infantry Division was in Kuwait as part of our operation there. And they actually were one of the first units in the Army that began transforming, which I think is great because, again, going back to time, when you are deployed, you're in theater, you have 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. When you're at home station, right, we have roughly 39 training days a year. We can get so much more accomplished when you're deployed because of the availability. But the key piece of this is going to be funding. So how do we fund the reserve component to do this? And there's primarily 3 ways. First of all, you want to be part of the Army program, right? That's always the best way. I'm part of the Army's program, so I'm just going to fall under their budget and I'm going to transform. The second way, which is used a lot, is what we call the National Guard Reserve Equipment Appropriation, NAGREA. Now, this is a program for all the reserve components, just not the National Guard. And so what it is Congress looks at and dialogues with the reserve component and says, okay, as it relates to your mission set, what is it that you don't have from your service? And we can appropriate money directly to that reserve component in order to help alleviate that problem. And the numbers fluctuate over a given year, but that money comes down with a little bit of direction. Congress will say, hey, we believe you need to use it for this. But really, the authority resides inside for us, for the National Guard, the chief of the National Guard Bureau, and in our case, the director of the Army Guard. Then we could allocate that money that was appropriated inside of our organization. And then the third way is that you can also receive money directly from your state. Now, that money is usually related to one of two things: facilities or what we call dual use equipment that I can use in my state mission as well as my federal mission. And of course, that's dependent on how much money does your state have. And so that funding varies significantly across the 50 states, 3 territories, and of course, the District of Columbia. So those are the 3 primary funding mechanisms as it relates to this. But what you want to be is we want to be part of the Army's program is where we want to be. It's a challenge. You look at facilities, let's just take facilities, for example. We still have over 2,100 Army Guard facilities in the United States. A lot of them were built in the 1950s. All right. So what does a 1950s armory look like? Well, in the 1950s, we didn't have women who served in the National Guard. So there's no facilities for women soldiers inside of that National Guard facility. And so it's certainly not ready for the challenges of the Army of the 21st century in terms of energy, space, and those types of items. So it's not always just necessarily, hey, I've procured this equipment. Hey, we're going to train on this equipment. It's like, well, can my facility even support this? And so it's a massive, massive bill as we modernize.
And of all those funding priorities, and a bit like the Big Six for the US Army, right? There are huge changes, everything from armor through logistics. Where does C2 as a priority hit within there? Because the program of records for the US Army, US Marine Corps, US Air Force, US Coast Guard even. I mean, we're talking about, they're putting in about $1.2, $1.3 trillion into C2. Are you able just to ride on the back of the Army program? Or is there something where the uplift, the time delay means that you've got to find a more inventive solution?
Well, we have to be part of the Army program first and foremost, right? So when we talk about command and control, part of that is the network. And so it's got to be, in our case, it has to be the Army's program, the Army's network. We can't vary at all from that because then it just causes downstream impacts later, right? We're not on a unified network anymore, and that's what all of the services we want to get to as it relates to joint domain or joint all domain command and control is that inside of our services, we can talk to everybody and then each service can speak and then ultimately our allies and partners can speak. And then to some degree, at some level, our agency partners as well. So we have to be a part of that. Otherwise, we're going to be standing outside of the Army looking in, right? If our divisions and brigades can't go into theater and operate on the Army net, and have the systems of the Army as it relates to next generation command and control, we'll be outside looking in. And we don't want to be outside looking in. We want to be a part of that. Now, Peter, as you know, then the challenge becomes, well, does that translate to our state partners? And it doesn't at all. And so what are the systems then that we need inside of our state to do our state mission?
And who funds that, right, as well? Because there's a whole thing, you're part of the transformation, other parts aren't. How do you start communicating? And that leads down to friction at the squad, the platoon, the company level, where you actually want stuff done. You've been on enough missions like I have to go, I almost don't care what the Joint Commander is saying. I need my people to get on with their task and purpose, right? And that's the key bit of the C2. So there must be some big challenges there. Is that reliant more on just people getting on with it? I mean, when you're talking about the complexity, the relationships, the communication, actually, you can't shrink a headquarters to get away from those requirements, right? Particularly if everyone can't be on the same network for the next 5, 7 years, whatever.
Yeah, I think, shrinking a headquarters, the way I look at it is the first time I reported into my division headquarters, it was 274 people. And then I deployed with a division headquarters years and years later, and there was like 1,200 people part of that headquarters. And so, it depends on how you want to count it, right? So in the old system, it was just the division headquarters, but you had an air defense battalion that then would augment you. You had the engineer battalion that would augment you. You had all these augmentees that would come to you. Later on, we created the division headquarters that had all that augmentation already a part of it. I've served on both. Both of them are exceptionally effective and did great things. Now, what might not change is the number, but what will change is what we're asking everybody to do, right, inside of that. And so let's just use artificial intelligence, for example. So when I was the chief of plans in S414, my plans team was relatively small. It was about 15 people. And we did all of the, if you will, all of the artificial intelligence work that now maybe your plans team only needs to be 4 people with artificial intelligence doing all of that heavy calculation and things like that. So the jobs of the people might change, but I always get a little nervous when people just say, well, the headquarters needs to get smaller. Well, of course the headquarters needs to get smaller, but what is it that you want them to do? As you talked about earlier, it just isn't mission command that a headquarters has to do, right? Now, suddenly I'm dealing with the mayor of a province in Iraq. I'm dealing with lawyers from the UN or NATO or EU, and you're doing all these other things that are beyond the scope of what you think your mission is as it relates to closing with and destroying the enemy. And so we just got to be very, very, very careful. As it relates to our state mission here in Minnesota, we're at the opposite end of that. We can very quickly overwhelm local emergency management, right? When we responded at the very end of our response in May of 2020, we had 7,123 soldiers and airmen on the ground in some role. We were by far the largest element that was on the ground. Our state police, 660 troopers, right? We had 7,123. Again, what traditionally the Army provides is mass. So you have to be careful. You can very quickly overwhelm people. As we entered COVID, I was able to take elements of my headquarters and very quickly get them looking at making projections as it relates to COVID. Not something we'd ever worked around, but these MI guys were amazing. They're analysts. They can analyze anything. And we started doing some of that work. Well, we very quickly overwhelmed what the Department of Health here in Minnesota was able to do. So you have to be careful here in the state that you understand your mission. You understand that you are always, always, always the supporting element, not the supported element. And sometimes we can come in heavy-handed and overwhelm the people who are really responsible for the mission.
You can level that charge at military people everywhere, I think. The ability to go and overwhelm a civilian headquarters is like common to all of us. Listen, John, we're coming to the end of our time. I'm just struck, reflecting on the last 35 minutes you and I have been chatting, that you have talked a lot more about people and organization than you have talked about technology. You're one of the few 3-stars I've spoken to the last 5 years that hasn't said AI every other word. I'm deeply aware you've done the SAMS course and all the other PME bits that go behind it. If you're talking to a young company commander now who's got aspirations to rise in the Guard, what are the secrets of C2 that you would say to that needs to be aware of in the future? Most people would say it's technology, get yourself AI aware and all that other stuff. I've got a feeling you might say something different, but I'm not sticking words in your mouth. What advice would you give?
Peter, this comes from an Army bias. The Army views ourselves as a people-centric organization, and it's always people first. Your ability to influence and motivate a soldier or a group of soldiers to accomplish the missions. The tools will always change, whether it's the Roman legionnaire, World War I, to whatever the future is going to be. Those tools are going to change, but it remains primarily a human endeavor. I mean, and this is the argument, right? Is this going to be robot on robot at some point? Maybe it is, but there's going to be a human element to warfare and to leadership. And in the Army, we put so much focus on leadership, that it's about leadership. It's about empowering those below you to accomplish the mission. And that, again, the tools are going to change. I enlisted in 1982. In 1982, we were still driving the World War II Jeep around, and so that's how far back I go. And so while the tools change, maybe the doctrine changes, it's a human endeavor. And so when I hear command and control, I always think about people and not the systems that allow you to do control. Because command, for me, command and control, it's the art and science. Command is the art. That is defined by the commander, how they are as a human being, as a man, as a woman, their experiences, their education background, all of those things. Command is the art. Control is the science. What's my processes? What are my systems? Things like that. And for us in the Army, it's first and foremost command, because the title that you always want to carry at any echelon is commander, not command and controller, right? It's commander. That's the title. So again, a very strong Army bias as it relates to that. That was the service I was proud to serve with for over 40 years. And it's really shaped not just my approach in terms of my service, but my whole life in terms of how I approach life. So it's been very good to me.
Jon, a huge honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sparing the time, but also thank you for your service. Please enjoy your retirement and enjoy the rest of your day. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 18 NATO members. SitAware is an industry-leading command and control software suite that is cloud-enabled, edge-capable, and coalition-ready.
We hope you enjoyed the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do hit the like or subscribe buttons. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com. Thanks for listening.